I hope you had a really good Christmas. It's such a strange year, but some of the things are the same, aren't they? The long build-up, the day which is packed full of food and fun, and then it's over. But that isn't the end of the story, is it? Because as Christians, we believe that the birth of Jesus was a beginning, a new beginning. And I'd like to look today at some of the stories that are associated with that first Christmas, that nativity. And let me read from Matthew chapter 2. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star, and it rose, and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling his chief priests and scribes, the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it's written by the prophet." And then Herod summoned the wise men secretly, and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you've found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." And after listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they'd seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Well, traditionally, we associate the visit of the wise men with the nativity, with the birth of Jesus. And we know that they came well after the birth of Jesus. Of course, they must have done, because they visited Jesus in a house, not in a manger. And we know that there were a few of them, perhaps 3, perhaps more. The Bible doesn't give us those numbers. And they weren't kings. They were probably astronomers, people devoted to figuring out, and I like this distinction, by the way, figuring out how God was influencing the heavens by what happened on earth. Don't you like that definition? Isn't that better than thinking that somehow we are guided by the stars? No, much more likely that God's story, which is taking place on earth, has influence in the heavens. And I don't know if you've been following the conflagration, or the coming together, conflagration, of course it isn't, the coming together of Saturn and Jupiter to form in the night sky something like a very bright star. Now, a mathematician and philosopher back in the 16th century traced this confluence, that's the word I was looking for, this confluence of the two planets back to about 4 BC. And that's where he calculated the birth of Jesus was. But isn't it cool that we're watching the same phenomenon in the skies that the wise men saw 2,000 years ago? Well, here's my thought. The Nativity is, in and of itself, it's an adventure story. And it's an adventure that rolls up everybody involved in that adventure. The shepherds. Now, I've been given to believe that the shepherds would leave somebody behind to look after the sheep. But what if they took the words of the angel seriously and immediately went to Bethlehem? Maybe someone thought of putting a bar over the gate, or some kind of barbed plant to stop the sheep coming out. Maybe that's all the thought they had. Maybe all of them went to visit the Christ child. And so that was an adventure. And there was an adventure in the sense that Mary and Joseph set out into the unknown. And they really weren't able to settle anywhere until after the death of this King Herod. And then there are the wise men traveling from the east to visit the Christ child, the child who was born the King of the Israelites, the King of Israel. Of course, Herod hated this idea. He was so paranoid that any threat to his power was seen as a threat worthy of death. And the Nativity, for all its wonder and all its beauty, has the terror of mothers weeping and wailing in Bethlehem because of the cruelty that has been visited on their children. So there we have it. An adventure that actually saves the lives of Mary, Joseph, and the newborn King Jesus. And in the middle of the adventure, those common, today you'd call them tropes, those common ideas that having arrived at the objective of the journey, there is rejoicing. Think of the shepherds. You know, they show up, and what the angel has told them, there it is. A child in a feeding trough. And during the adventure, we have Mary pondering, wondering what's happening. She's developing, isn't she, in her understanding of God because of the adventure that her life takes her on. What about Joseph? This wasn't what he expected. He expected to settle down, to keep going with his carpentry business, maybe to build a house, buy some property, or inherit some property. Instead, marrying Mary takes Joseph on the adventure of a lifetime. We don't know what happens to Joseph, but we assume he died after Jesus' bar mitzvah at the age of 12. Sometime after that, between Jesus being 12 and 30, Joseph must have died. He had other children, obviously, with Mary, but his life was really not what he thought it would be. And then these kings, these wise men, bringing gifts, and at the end of their journey, because the end is meeting Jesus, they fall down and worship, and they bring in gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And gold for a king, frankincense for worship, myrrh to anoint the body for burial. Well, I have a few simple thoughts as ever, and they are on this idea that the first Christmas, this nativity, this birth of Christ, was surrounded by people who were adventurous. Now, I love adventure, and my adventures are medium-sized. I love to walk in the mountains or in the hills. I love to have the wind, even the rain, in my face. I love to feel that I've been somewhere. I'm not really delighted by danger, but I love to see large vistas, to look at a mountain from the bottom up and to look from the top down. It just fills me with delight. It does. And I've tried to share some of this over time with good, dear people, and I just love having an adventure that involves other people. I can remember, I used to look after my children when they were not at school on a Wednesday because they went to a Moroccan school and Wednesdays were off. And we used to devise adventures like driving up a dry riverbed or sliding in a water trough up in the mountains. We just loved adventures, and we learned to surf together, not because I'm good at surfing, but because it was something that we could do together. And there's something wonderful about the adventure. Faith is an adventure. Faith can't be about comfort, and it can't be about being static. In the first nativity, faith took people to extremes of danger, extremes of discomfort, extremes of giving. Faith took them there. And they become part of the story because God works out in the open. He works in a way that people can see, and they don't always recognize that, do they? The people around Zechariah, who was also an adventurer when you think about it, adventuring his prayer in the temple instead of the prayer for the people. The people on the outside, listening in, wondering what's happening, they're witnesses of the events. When he comes out dumbfounded, they talk about it among themselves. The shepherds, witnesses to the angel and to the message. Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to those with whom he is pleased. Adventure. And witnesses to that adventure. I don't know if you ever watched any of the great sort of mountain adventures of the 1980s, 90s. There was always a sense of expectation. And lots of cameras at the bottom of the mountain with large telescopic sights looking up the mountain. And the manufacturers of mountain clothing always made the clothing very bright. Now that's for safety, but it's also so that it could be seen. And it's saying, I was there, I watched it. I didn't do the adventure, I didn't risk my life, but I watched it happen. That's really something, isn't it? And there are witnesses to the wise men coming to see Herod. Because the priests, Herod's priests, or the priests at the temple, they remember. And they are disconcerted by this. It troubles them. So God calls us to the adventure of faith. And then he shows himself to people around. And some of them, like the priests and King Herod, they don't like what they see. And that's not okay, but it's okay. It's to be expected that not everybody will be able to interpret what they see in the right way. Maybe because self gets in the way. But we know as well that there are a crowd of people who are a bit neutral. And when they watch the adventure, this adventure of faith changes them because it changes their minds about the greatness of God and the glory of God. When Zechariah speaks up, the people rejoice and they tell it to each other. So we've got the adventure of the Nativity, and we've got the witnesses who continue to tell about it, because the purpose of a witness is to look and to tell, to see and to speak. Have you ever thought that as a witness you become part of the story? There's an archive it might be in the British Library, but certainly the BBC are very diligent about this, where people are interviewed after big events, or even just interviewed about normal life, and they keep this archive of hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of spoken, witnessed events. And these make up a sense of who we are. So after the coronation, ordinary people are interviewed and they talk about the coronation, and somehow they become connected to the story of the coronation. I think it's called Vox Pop. So what you see and what you tell changes you, and you become part of the story. And your part might be ever so small. In faith terms, it might be to say, do you know, I know that when Jesus was born, he was born for me and he was born for you. That might be all your part in the story is. But do you see how important it is that we recognize that to be witnesses of Jesus is to become part of his story? And we know at the end of the Bible, the throne of God is thronged with tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and more people than can be conceived, who bear witness to what they've seen and what they've heard. In Hebrews chapter 12, we're told that we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Maybe people like the wise men, or the shepherds, or even Mary and Joseph themselves, that we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And these witnesses, well, they have two purposes. First of all, they see what Jesus has done and they proclaim it. And then, because we're surrounded by these witnesses, they encourage us on. And we become part of a much greater picture of witnessing to the events of Jesus' birth and his death and his resurrection and his living today. We become part of it, part of the story. Faith is an adventure. And you and I, we might be about to partake in another adventure. Maybe we're being asked by God to do something, like Joseph. We'll have to obey, and we don't know the outcome. We just know to get up and move on And God will have to take care of the outcome. And for some of us, we're being called to give a part of ourselves, something precious, in worship to God. And it'll be costly. But God's asking us to do that. So, again, we learn obedience. But it's the adventure of faith. We don't know the outcome. And perhaps as churches, at a time like this, we're being called on to go on an adventure. It's a different adventure. The land is unplotted as far as we're concerned. But we have a map, and that's the Bible. That's our constant. That's where the route doesn't vary and the landscape doesn't change very much. And we also have someone to go with us. And a good companion on an adventure is the best thing ever. Jesus is that companion. Do you remember he walked on another adventure from Jerusalem out to a small town called Emmaus? And the men were dismayed. They didn't know where to go, what was to follow. And then he opened the map to them. And he described the place that they'd been and the route by which they were going to get there. And he talked about God fulfilling in him all that he'd promised. All that he'd promised. You see, Jesus is our companion on the journey. He's our shepherd. That means that when we read Psalm 23 and we learn that he goes on an adventure with us, through or past the valley of the shadow of death, whatever that means, he's with us. His rod, his staff comforts us. He prepares a table before us in the presence of our enemies. Because Jesus is the good shepherd. What is the adventure that God is calling you to do? Don't fear it. Adventure's part of life, part of the changing scene of life. Adventure develops us in our faith foremost, in our knowledge secondly. Faith develops in us a sense of expectation of what will follow. May God grow in us adventure faith in 2021. And let's follow this child who was born to be a king. Let's go on that adventure with him. May God bless you in all your plans, all your thoughts, all your hopes, all your dreams. May God bless you in your going out and you coming in. May God bless you in your rising. May God bless you along the journey. May God bless you and pour out his blessings upon you day by day. And may our faith grow to the big adventure. Happy Christmas.